certain breeds are predisposed to specific diseases. When we think about extending the best life possible for our pets, it's what's the best life possible for that pet.
Everybody who's doing anything in big data is talking about digital twinning, using data to build as comprehensive a map of an individual based on the data that's available.
If we knew the breed makeup, the gender, the age, and the area in which that animal lives, we can tell you a whole lot.
We are seeing tools introduced into veterinary practice now that provide a level of prediction. They're taking those data and they're combining them with studies that exist currently in veterinary medicine and saying, if you do a dental or if you start this pet on this medication, this is how the risks change.
Welcome to the Dog Longevity Project. I'm your host, Dr. David Hallworth, a veterinarian with a PhD in physiology and a passion for the bond that we have with our pets. I have spent a whole career exploring all the different ways we connect with our pets. And with this podcast, I'm talking to some of the brightest minds in the field about ways pet owners can help their pets live the longest, fullest version of the lives possible. This podcast is brought to you by Panio, a platform to bring together all the data around your pet. And if you want to learn more, it's panio.io. Today, we're going to talk to Dr. Jules Benson, one of my dear friends and also one of the smartest people in the industry, focusing on his information and ideas on big data and how that can all come together in veterinary medicine so that we can learn. But like always, we're going to start off by learning more about Jules. So Jules, for the benefit of everybody here, could you talk to us about your story?
Yeah, thanks, David. So I'm also a veterinarian trained in the UK. I've been here in the US for about 20 years. I was in practice in Pennsylvania initially and was just lucky enough to be in a great mentoring practice where, people were willing to teach you, surgical techniques and, internal medicine and, all kinds of fun stuff. But I always, when I was in school, I took another degree in veterinary conservation medicine. So in the UK, you don't have to do undergraduate. You just kind of go from 18 from school into vet school. But you have the option to intercalate. So you can take an extra year and get another bachelor's. And so I did veterinary conservation medicine. I think mostly because I was interested in the maths behind, things like epidemiology and, how these things interact. And that has kind of gone on to guide a lot of the rest of my career, but mostly because I didn't think I wanted to be in practice forever. And so being in practice, even with these great people and potentially the opportunity for ownership down the road, I think my eye was always on what is the thing? What is the other thing I could be doing? And that was one of the great lessons that were taught to me by my mentor in this program, in this conservation medicine program, Professor Malcolm Bennett, who always said, as veterinarians, your skill set is maybe much more than you would think.
Can I probe on that for just a second, Jules?
Yeah.
So you said that you thought you probably didn't want to stay in practice. It was obviously a thought that I also had fairly early on in my training. Why?
I think for me, it was just being in practice and seeing, vets who'd been there, who were in their, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I think we're just, especially in general practice, we're just kind of like done with the day-to-day that you just, and I think that's a personality thing. And I think it was more a reflection of me seeing my personality in them than looking at people who've been in practice for 30 years and many of them very satisfied with their jobs and the interactions and the place they serve in the community. But I think I saw more of myself in those who were like, were there other things that I could have been doing that I might enjoy more? You could be out there doing serosurveillance on rhinos or, removing horns or whatever else to prevent, hunters. Or you could be in a boardroom arguing about, habitat management, and the impact you'd have at that level is different. I mean, it's not better or worse. It's just there are people who have to do that job as well, and you may have a skill set that means you could, get up to that level.
I often say you could develop a drug, for instance, or create a policy around wildlife conservation that impacts millions of lives, but it's awfully hard to be a hero in these roles. Like when I was an emergency practicing veterinarian and, you saw the English bulldog go into cardiac arrest right in front of you, you grabbed him out of the cage, you administered CPR, dog comes back to life.
Yeah.
You're a hero.
Satisfying. Yeah.
But you're not, you made a great deep impact on that one animal and on that one animal's family. Didn't maybe make the same kind of impact on, you can't scale that.
I think there's a huge part of that. I mean, we talked about this at the Innovation Summit just a couple of months ago, this concept of the Overton window, right? This political concept of the window of regular conversation that is sensible and or policy. A lot of it is in the industry are often more on the edges of, what feels outrageous or feels, really outside the comfort zone. And I think even when you're right, even if you're one of the first people talking about something, I talk about this a lot, there's no cookie for like being 5 years down the road and everyone is suddenly on board with the idea that you'd kind of posited at that point. Like there's no cookie for being an early adopter except the relationships you build. And I think that the belief in the work, that it's the right work and that it is benefiting, pets, people and veterinary healthcare teams.
And by the way, by that time, it's no longer your idea. You didn't.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
In fact, you sort of have to accept the idea that, oh yeah, right. All those people who were criticizing us, 5 years ago,
right.
And we became rabid adopters 2.5 years ago. Now it's their idea, and
nobody comes to you and shakes you by the hand gravely and says, "Thank you so much for that pioneering work." That's not how this works. And a lot of this is just being comfortable saying it's good to be on the edge of these ideas and to feel confident about pushing the envelope.
Yeah, I think that is one of the driver forces for us creating this podcast around longevity. Longevity is still, to me, it feels like everything I listen to in human medicine. But I know it's still a very new concept in human medicine, and in veterinary medicine, we are scratching the surface. And I think one of the things you and I are going to explore over the next half hour is sort of what can we put a pin in and just and actually say, yep, nope, that's right. So we'll get to that. I've interrupted your story. You're still a young lad studying under Professor Bennett with wildlife conservation.
Yeah. And so I worked in practice in Pennsylvania. I really enjoyed practice, but then was offered an opportunity to join a startup, which I think that's where you and I met when I was working at Petplan in a startup insurance company. And I was there for about 8 years and just kind of filled my head, I think, to your point around curiosity. A startup is just an amazing place to be able to learn and to wear so many hats and to build amazing relationships with team members. And it's just the pressure cooker really does make or break so much of that.
Just for context for everyone else, Petplan was one of the early entrants into the pet insurance organizations. And Jules has since gone on to much bigger organizations in that insurance area, which is one of those culminant areas of big data.
I've had 2 stints in pet health insurance, and certainly the most recent one was really because of the value and the opportunity I saw in the data set. That was my interest. It was a funny decision to say, do I want to go back into pet insurance? It wasn't something intrinsically that lit my fire, but I think the ability to try and use data to improve the lives of pets and pet families was that was my driving rationale, which just aligned so well with what the company was doing at the time. But really the through line of my story has been how do we use data to improve the lives of our stakeholders? Well,
you're an expert generalist. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's always appealed to me about our conversations. You have this interesting macro observation that it was personified, it was specified within Circa when you were working at strategy levels. You had to think about meta company wide. So it could be the most interesting aspect of some kind of medicine, but if there wasn't a market to sell that, which may sound cold-blooded and capitalist, but in reality, a market identifies a need, and as that need identifies a real missing thing out there.
So one of the areas that has kind of sprung out of this, and it's really been more of a collaboration with again another mutual friend of ours, Dr. Emily Tincher. When she came to Nationwide, she brought with her spectrum of care as a concept, which again not that she created this, but certainly I think she was the first one to bring it up with me. And we've gone on to talk and publish a lot on that topic together, and I think you can look at that and say, well, data and spectrum of care seem such different concepts, and spectrum of care is this this area of molding the care that we provide to the needs of the beliefs of pet families, within the realms of evidence-based care and our capabilities as practitioners. And I think that you can say, okay, one's kind of warm and fuzzy about providing good care, and the other one's kind of cold hard data. But I think both Emily and I are very, very cognizant that only through the use of data can you provide sustainable business models that drive spectrum of care. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into data sets. But
yeah, and I think the concept of spectrum of care, which may not be familiar to everyone is in veterinary medicine, we often talk about gold standards or a standard of care. And that means that when you come in with your pet and you're complaining about, well, if it's a vague thing, we need to run a series of diagnostic tests that might give you a high upfront bill. But a spectrum of care means changing that philosophy to offering multiple options, informing the pet parent such that they can make an informed decision.
This concept of relationship-centered veterinary medicine or client-centric care really does get down to it. I think I've certainly felt this, and when I look back on my time in general practice, there's definitely a history of medicine generally being very paternalistic and being, hey, we as the wearers of white coats know what's best, and we'll provide you with a map to get there. And I think now kind of this cultural shift of saying, how do we become more centered around what the needs of the client is? And a common condition is cruciate ligament injury, right? We see that in a lot of, especially medium and large breed dogs. And there's a bunch of different ways to look at that. There's certainly, the most advanced surgical techniques, which can be costly. But there are also, more middling techniques, more intermediate techniques, which have evidence behind them. And we'll get into evidence.
Long history of do you have the dog who wants to run 27 miles a day? No, but you might.
And what are the trade-offs that you as a pet owner are willing to make, right? So, and I think that's our role is creating this shared decision-making matrix around here is what we can do. Help me understand your situation and what your goals are, and then let's understand what the options are together. So that really, to me, is like the sharp and pointy end of spectrum of care.
I love that. Which is a good point to transition into how we're thinking today around big data. I think there's an aspect here where certainly when I came into practice 25 years ago, we still used data. We would just use defined studies and what our professors had told us because they'd spent their careers working on orthopedic surgery. And then we tried to absorb what we could during our training period, and then we just took that forward. There was a lot of data behind that, but it was pretty static. And it didn't really, once you believed that you used 80-pound test monofilament fishing wire essentially to stabilize a knee joint, a stifle joint on a dog, I didn't need to know anything else. And if I did, eventually those publications and peer discussions would generally push me to that. But now we've got access to so much more. And so I guess the question here is about your vision around big data into veterinary medicine and how we help our pet parents.
It's certainly a spectrum. So I think there are still certainly practitioners who are where we were, 25 years ago in terms of this is the information I get from my education, from my continuing education that I'm exposed to in marketing materials or in publications. And it's like kind of that Bayesian process of like, here's where I am. How are you going to convince me otherwise type thing, which I think is a completely rational approach to the practicing medicine. We don't have a lot of the tools that are starting to crop up from big data sets in human medicine. So Up to Date is a really good example of that, right? In terms of saying, okay, if you have a patient with X condition, Up to Date will provide you with a summary of the most prevalent and recent research on this topic and what the evidence base says.
And so Up to Date is a web platform, human data set that you pay for as a physician, and you say, I'm talking to a strikingly handsome 45-year-old from the UK, and he has this orthopedic issue. What does the science tell?
Have you talked to your optometrist, for example, would be a good leading question for that. The good news is we're starting to make strides. We have some inherent weaknesses in veterinary medicine, and I think for all of the evils that befall human healthcare, one of the reasons that they're ahead of us on the data side is because of the requirements for regulation around human healthcare data. And frankly, again, this is a silver lining to something that's generally viewed as a terrible problem, but our third-party payer system. So between Medicare, Medicaid, and the third-party payer system, there are requirements around not just the ability to access data and the standardization of those data, but also for data systems to be able to talk to each other.
And that is all because those third-party payment systems and government third-party payment systems are incentivized to be efficient and to move us forward on that in human healthcare. And in veterinary care, we just don't have those same incentive systems. There's no one really incentivized to help us use that, except just pride and wanting to provide the best practice that we can.
So much of the data, if you think about how we look at, as we study any disease condition, there's a bunch of different ways of studying a disease, right? There's the gold standard, which is a double-blinded prospective study where you're saying, okay, we're going to treat some people over here one way and some people another way. And the reality is that those studies are incredibly expensive and difficult to run and to control. And the majority of the data that we have in animal healthcare is not based on those kinds of studies. And you're much closer to this than I am, of course.
What we're finding out is now, looking back, many of those fundamental studies we didn't actually control for many of the more pertinent and what we now know are relevant cases. For instance, much of the work on cardiovascular disease was done in Framingham, Massachusetts, coming out of one of the most brilliant longitudinal studies of all time. However, that population was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly middle class, and a suburb of basically a town out 50 miles outside of Boston. And so many of those lessons that we pulled from there have a difficult time being applied to specific other cases that aren't white, middle class, from Northern European ancestry. I think in veterinary medicine, that's doubly interesting because we rarely even get the benefit of working with our target species. Many times we're talking about, well, this is a human study, but we think that the liver in a dog is pretty similar to the liver of a human. And so therefore, let's pull that through. I think as we continue to evolve this idea of up-to-date or an analogous system for how do we know what's best for dogs, we will learn so much more about the application to that specific patient, which is really a key piece of the whole longevity personalization question. Because when we think about extending the best life possible for our pets, it's what's the best life possible for that pet. And that's a lot of nutrition, and certain diseases certain breeds are predisposed to specific diseases. That doesn't mean they're preordained. It just means they're predisposed. And so we've got, this is where I think we can get very excited about the potential of big data and the application. But I think where your perspective is so valuable is it's nice to talk about the potential in vet med.
Yeah.
But where are we?
Well, and so I think, so let's say, and again, human healthcare is very, very much an imperfect system, and it's more imperfect in some countries than others, right? So we know that there's, opportunities and challenges there. So this is by no means an endorsement of what we have certainly in the US healthcare system. It goes further in human healthcare, right? So we've heard a lot on the tech side recently about some of the changes at Epic, which is an enormous healthcare, electronic health records and digital ecosystem. That human healthcare is the most predominant system on the human healthcare side, certainly here in the US. And they've been using concepts, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, around things like digital twinning. Hey, if I'm looking at you, at a white man who lives in Montana, who is of a certain age and has certain genetic predispositions, I can tell you what the case summaries have been for other people in your circumstance, right? So, and I think digital twinning, especially around longevity and big data, is one of these. It's become a little bit of a watchword. I think now everybody who's doing anything in big data is talking about digital twinning, and ultimately it's as you said, it's building, using data to build as comprehensive a map of an individual based on the data that's available, and then simulating what could happen to that individual, right?
This is worth us talking about just briefly, because I think so much of what's interesting about what we can do in the future with greater exactitude is a higher fidelity version of what we can do today or what we could do 30 years ago. If you talk to any experienced, I would say veterinarian, but basically anybody experienced in animal wellness, health, and said, okay, I can give you 4 pieces of data about a specific case, about a specific patient. If we knew the breed makeup, whether that's a multiple of breeds or even better, a purebred, if we know the breed makeup, the gender, the age, and the area in which that animal lives or the circumstances under which that animal lives, rural, urban, high-rise apartment, farm, we can tell you a whole lot. I mean, you and I could prevent just with those 4 pieces
Absolutely.
of information, provide a pretty credible picture,
like a fuzzy generalization.
Yeah.
We could certainly, hem some of the information in and say, you're never going to see this. You're much more likely to see this. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I bet they like to,
Right.
I bet they really like to do this, and we'll be right most of the time. If you fast forward to the Star Trek, belief system of here's this digital twin where I know every way that this body is going to respond to different types of things. It's cool. But it's a higher fidelity version of what we can do today. How far are we from that version?
So we're a little way. And so I think, another way of looking at this was one of the projects that my team created when I was at Nationwide, which was the pet health zone, right? And when I talked to veterinarians, this was really about taking data from millions and millions of years of insurance data and saying exactly what you said. So based on your breed, based on the age of that breed, what are the things that are likely to see? And I think going back to our 25-year practitioner, it was a really good example. I remember when I was in practice in Pennsylvania, I had a really good client who had Havanese dogs. And so he had 2 dogs. And I think we had probably 1 or 2 other Havanese in the practice. They just weren't a super common breed for our area. And I think they're still fairly low penetration. Very nice little dogs.
Just so everybody knows what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Describe a Havanese dog, Havanese breed.
It's a little, I can't remember, they were white and chocolate or white and light brown, these ones. And I think they come in a variety of different hues to that effect, 20-ish pounds, 15 to 20 pounds, full of personality. They're not dissimilar in attitude and they're kind of like a happier version of a Shih Tzu, I guess. Like it's kind of how I would imagine they're like.
Yeah, Havanese are just happier Shih Tzus.
Yeah. And very, just bright and very, I mean, so not unlike some of the other dogs of that size. This is the sum of my experience. Nobody at school ever told me anything about Havanese dog. There's no CE around Havanese dogs. My exposure is limited to 3 dogs out of the thousands that I will see in my career. And so some of what we were saying at Nationwide was like, okay, well, we're working with 8,000 Havanese dogs. So we're amping up the experience that you could have gained in practice. Basically, it would take you, thousands of years working in practice to see this many dogs. And we're going to give you this information and say, this is what we're seeing based on this. We are seeing tools introduced into veterinary practice now that start to try and at least provide a level of prediction. So you probably saw this recently. There's a tool called Pointer Health, which recently got some additional sponsorship from a prominent person in industry, John Ayres. And that's what they're doing. They're saying, okay, they're taking those data and they're combining them with studies that exist currently in veterinary medicine and saying not just based on, the data we have, this is what your dog will look like and these are the risks. But if you do a thing, if you do a dental or if you start this pet on this medication, this is how the risks change. So that's the level of dynamism that we're talking about when we talk about true digital twinning. And there's huge runway. Like we're talking about still very large general models at the moment. The more information we have and the more variables that we can actually gather compelling data on and how not just those variables change things, but the multiplicity of variables. So every time it's not enough to say, hey, it's a Havanese and it's 8 years old and it's living in Massachusetts. Then you can start saying, okay, well, if it's 8 years old in Massachusetts, do those two things confound? Is there a communication between those 2 pieces of data that you can't study in isolation? So I think the more information that basically the bigger the data set we have, the greater the opportunity we have to identify how those variables exist in isolation and how they exist in communication with each other.
And I think this is also one of those reasons. One of the areas that get me very excited, as you know, is where areas where there is a potential for veterinary medicine to leapfrog ahead of human health. And I would make the argument that because of the very intentional inbreeding of dogs, that we can know much more. When we talk about dog breeds, we're talking about behaviors and phenotypes or physical characteristics, which we very intentionally bred in. Many dog breeds, in fact, the genetics matter much less than the way that they actually look. So the genetics, a dog could look like an English bulldog for lots of reasons, not all of them genetic, but if they don't look like an English bulldog, then they're not an English bulldog. And same thing when we talk about behaviors, a retriever retrieves. It is inherent in the way that they were brought together. And so when we talk about creating these digital twins, we start, I think, kind of on the, already 50 yards into the 100-yard dash, because we know so much about an animal from its breed. Now we can overplay that hand pretty readily because there's lots of variability between all Labrador retrievers. But I think this is an interesting aspect, and I think Nationwide or any of the larger insurance companies, as you said, we may inherently have some ideas of the diseases or conditions that Havanese dogs are predisposed to, but you actually have the data. You can say, yep, that actually bears truth.
We have some data from a subpopulation. So again, this is where these things start to come in. And there are always great questions. I mean, are insured dogs inherently different, or are they the same as other pets? And I think there's one factor in here, and this is, when we talk about genetics versus epigenetics, genetics are the potential of the pet, and the epigenetics are those external factors that can affect the genetic expression of an animal. I think the human is one of the most powerful epigenetic factors that we don't really talk about. And I think, coming from an insurance company point of view, there was always this great conversation around wearables. Hey, can we use wearables on pets, to monitor their activity, to better understand their health? And I think my realization came to, I would rather see the wearable activity of the owner rather than the pet. I think that would give me more information about how this pet was going to be treated and what their lifestyle was than the pet itself. And I think similarly with even attitudes towards medicalization, especially for an insurance company, right? It would be very helpful to know, hey, are you somebody who's going to pursue every possible, medical fissure, in order to treat this pet? And is your philosophy where there's life, there's hope? Or are you somebody who's maybe more, pragmatically minded and says, if my pet, breaks its leg or has a cruciate ligament injury, I definitely want to treat that, but I don't want to do advanced chemotherapy on my pet if the quality of life is going to be lower.
Yeah, this is so on point when it comes to longevity conversations, because in humans, it's quite easy to talk about length of life and quality of life, because ultimately the determinant almost all the time is going to be biology. Biology is going to tell us when and if I stop breathing. But in pets, it's a very different story. The statistics are very hard to come by, but somewhere 60+% of animals who are owned in the United States die from euthanasia. Now, clearly there was something preceding that euthanasia, and hopefully, and I have to believe in 99+% of the time, that's a quality of life question, that this dog, my dog has finally hit a level of quality of life without enough hope for it to become a great quality of life again, that we're going to choose to euthanize.
Which is super subjective. Again, the quality of life, we as veterinarians know that is an enormous spectrum of how people consider and think about quality of life. And
to your point, that question is so inherent in that individual pet owners' philosophies around things. As you know, our listeners probably don't know, I've spent a lot of time around cancer in dogs. And, one of the common things for a limb cancer is to recommend amputation of that limb. Countless conversations with people who would say, there's no way I would ever want my dog to go through life without one of their legs. And those then also maybe, thankfully, many more countless conversations about how dogs are really born with 3 legs and a spare. As long as you've got three legs, the dog wakes up from surgery, doesn't kind of looks down, realizes one thing's missing, and it just immediately shifts to a three-legged lifestyle.
And it is not. I think again, unless you have the medical information over how incredibly painful something like bone cancer is in pets, and the relief that you're providing, it's not just again, you're not. This isn't just a survival mechanism. This is a treatment modality. This is better than providing opiates or something else. This is actually,
removes
a real quality of life measure
and gives absolutely. A better quality of life. I want to be clear here that this is not a moral judgment on those people who choose to euthanize their pet instead of undergo amputation. But it's just an illustration of how variable this is in different people's lifestyles and outlooks. And we have that control over our pets, whereas we have less of a control even over our own health.
100%. And there are two different conversations if it's a 14-year-old pet versus if it's a 6-year-old pet. Like those are two entirely different things around whether you would do a limb amputation, for example. I always recommend for pet owners, a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Mary Gardner, has a great book called It's Never Long Enough, which is just full of the most pragmatic and practical advice around end of life for pets. She's just such a phenomenal figure in this space. And I think someone who's seen so much of this and just provides amazing advice. So just again,
for our listeners, Mary is also one of the founders of Lap of Love, which is one of the nationally scaled at-home euthanasia services. So again, there will be many times on this podcast we'll refer to end-of-life care and palliative care and gerontology when it comes to, because that I think goes hand in hand and very naturally follows into a longevity conversation. Let me bring us back to data quickly. So if you had a magic wand and could create the data set that you would most like to see, describe that for us.
I mean, this is somewhat disingenuous on your part, I feel like, David, because you have played a key role in one of the most incredible data sets we have access to in animal health, which is the
disingenuous. I would call it ingenious, whatever you want.
Which is the Morris Animal Foundation Golden Retriever Lifetime Study. And I don't know you probably give a better summary of that than I do at this point.
It was a study that we started in 2011 or 12, depending on when you want to call it started, where we recruited 3,000 golden retrievers in houses across the country. And then every year their owners would fill out a very extensive questionnaire and then take them to the veterinarian, and the veterinarians would fill out an extensive health questionnaire as well as collect biosamples of blood, urine, feces, hair samples, nail samples. We did a genetic test. Some of those animals wore wearables so that we could really understand, at least in that subset, about activity levels. So it is a very good, very complete data set. But even then, if I had all that data, how am I helping the golden retrievers of tomorrow, including the one that's laying down on the floor next to me? I'm not sure we are.
Well, so I think I think if you could say, okay, that is an ideal data set. Plus, and things have moved, even since then, right? So there are additional data that we would gather now, in terms of certainly the genetics, probably certainly in terms of the lifestyle. There's a lot of information there on nutrition, which, I think that's a gold mine probably that is, fairly, overlooked at this point. I would say.
Well, I think it's, by the way, nutrition is just pushed to the side, because the fact of the matter is, all of us know that ultra processed foods are probably not great for us as humans. Yeah. Now, of course, when you and I were being raised, ultra processed food was the best thing we possibly could do for ourselves. Yeah. And Swanson TV dinners and Tang was, considered to be high cuisine, at least in my household. But we've now moved to mostly fresh, minimally processed food for you and I, but our pets are still eating extruded kibble. I think jury's out, frankly, but that's a bigger question. You're right. We do have a lot of new information but ideally, how do you take all that data from even a fairly large cohort of animals and translate that to action?
So I just want to talk to go back to nutrition. Like the only data, one of the few compelling data points that we have both in human and animal longevity is calorie deficit. So regardless of food source, that seems to be the eating fewer calories, than I eat probably is likely to give people, the calorie deficit is one of the hard data points that we have that seems to be,
somewhere between 50 and 75% of satiety. So until if I'm only 50% full most of the time, that has been shown in humans, rodents, and dogs to extend lifespan. Now in humans, interestingly enough, best line I ever heard about this, when you ask people who are on a 70% satiety diet how they're feeling, most of them are angry and hungry all the time. And so if you think that life, longevity is really about creating the best life for the longest time possible, angry and hungry is probably not the way I want to go through my existence. But
there's probably a spectrum all the way through to I eat until I hate myself, right? That's the old line.
That's me. Most people. Yeah.
So what do we do with the data? So I think that we're starting to see some of the tools that will help us with that. I think until we have a data set that we can reliably interrogate, and I think that's why it's worth calling the Golden Retriever Lifetime Study data out, is I think that's a great place to start. I think when you start applying tools to data sets, it's such a completist data set. Now it's limited by breed. It's limited by geographic location. It's the United States. So there are benefits to and confounding factors to being in the specific. And you all knew this when you started this program,
right?
So it gives you great tools. It gives you a great data set to be able to test tools and say, okay, if we had these data across multiple dogs, across multiple species, how much data would we need? And I think that's one of the biggest areas that is really challenging, because I think even when you look at the, when we talked about things like genetic testing, combining, there seems to be an inherently, logical thing of saying, okay, you have insurance data about the risks of disease. And just again, for our listeners, there are not good data sets on diseases in animal health. We're starting to see more of them come out of programs like Vet Compass in the UK and Australasia, where as data are coming in through practice management systems, through electronic health records that we use, they are being indexed and sent to a centralized place for processing and utilization. And so they're building, and this is mostly through the Royal Veterinary College under people like Dan O'Neill, who are doing amazing work in this space. But that is a very deliberate countrywide effort, and not all practices are part of this, but it's growing into a considerable data set with millions of pets. We don't have anything approaching that here in the US at the moment. Most of the data are locked into practice management systems. They're basically firewalled, and even the data within those data sets are not well indexed. If you go back to our example with human healthcare, and as much as billing is the worst thing for everybody and everybody hates the administrative task, billing and condition codes are key to being able to look back at data and say, okay, if you're a 50-year-old male in this area and you've had this, this, and this, I can tell the diseases you've had. And again, it's not a perfect system, but when you build a big enough data set, you start to build cohesion. We don't have that ability at the moment. So I think until we're in a position to be, and I think that there's also this belief that AI will solve all this for us. And I'm sure you'll talk to some super smart people who have much more knowledge about this than I do. But everyone I've talked to in the AI space firmly believes that the key to really utilizing AI in healthcare is solid underlying data.
Machines can't learn by themselves, even though we would like them to believe. And you're right. There are, even imperfect, very large data sets can forgive a lot of sins. But what you're saying around reportability is I think a critical thing for pet parents to understand. There are very few reportable diseases in veterinary medicine. Basically those that have high epidemiology significance, like rabies or distemper or certainly livestock diseases that can transmit largely and have high economic value. Most things, cancer rates, for instance, people will talk about, golden retrievers get cancer all the time. We don't really know that very well. I mean, we've got good studies, but they come out of fairly limited data sets. And so I think it's a really great point for us to keep in mind, in that there are places where we can kind of come sideways and get good data. Insurance companies being a great one, because, if you're paying for chemotherapy for a large number of animals,
hopefully you'll know that you're paying for chemotherapy, right?
Hopefully know what they're getting chemotherapy for. Same thing with cruciate surgeries or other very finite things. What we also don't have is any good information around age of actual life expectancy. We don't know how old dogs are when they die. There isn't even in Middle Ages, there were church records of births and deaths and marriages, whereas we don't have those for dogs. We have a lot of anecdotes, and the plural of anecdote is oftentimes data. But
well, I will say we are starting to see that. There are studies out using the Vet Compass data set that are starting to look at mortality, for example. And I think I will say that there are opportunities, that there are organizations that span some of these large medical record data sets in the US. And I will say that the artificial intelligence tools, or the data tools that we have now, are going to be much better at contextualizing the medical records that we have. So, and David, that much of the information is buried in prose. It's, hey, I saw this dog today and he was limping on his left front leg. That is not contained in a discrete piece of data somewhere. It has to be parsed out of that. So it takes a huge amount of compute and processing power to go through all those medical records and say, find every dog that was limping on its left front leg. But that is now possible, whereas it wasn't even 3 years ago. So I do think the future of utilizing the data that we have is much, much brighter than it has been before.
So if I could put a big bow on all of this conversation, I think what I'm hearing you say, and I'm hoping I hear you say, it feels like we have to be very clear-eyed around what exists today and where we are both have potential for being more advanced than human medicine, but also don't have some of the inherent advantages that human medicine has built into their systems. But there is also great reasons to be excited about where we could potentially come from and get more data in a very fast way. We've got some things that can allow us to talk about longevity and help pet parents create better and longer lives for their pets inherently than in human medicine. But then we also have some areas where we can't, but the future is pretty bright. Anything to add to that?
No, I think I would just say in terms of longevity, I mean, I think the science behind the current longevity treatments and kind of the companies that are evolving around longevity is super exciting. I think what I want to make sure that we have is that when we talk about a longevity therapy, that there are data that exist to help us make that decision, to say, okay, if I'm starting a 7-year-old dog who has this genetic baggage, how much could this be helping versus, and again, this is all going to be incremental. Like we'll never be able to say to a 7-year-old dog owner, an owner of a 7-year-old dog, sorry, that this will undoubtedly let the dog live 3 years longer. Like you can't provide those guarantees, but I think being able to provide the data that shows that, hey, all other things being equal, this science allows your pet to do X, Y, and Z differently than it would otherwise. I think that's super exciting.
I think you're absolutely spot on, and I think the mythos would be that someday we'll be able to tell you exactly when your date of death is. Well, of course we can't, because 2 weeks prior to that you might step in front of a bus. Just as with our pets, there's no way we're ever going to be able to say inherently we know exactly when this Havanese is going to die. They will live 14 years and 3 months. But we can start with the longevity questions of, we know that these are detrimental factors. So whatever that ultimate biological capacity is, we know that obesity, secondhand smoke in the house, living under high power lines, drinking water from Chernobyl, all of those things are going to be decreasing from that potential. And inherently, we want to try to decrease that number of that. As always, we try to end this with asking you to two pieces of media that if this conversation was really resonating with somebody who is listening to us, where would you direct them to do a little bit of homework and build off that next incremental step?
I mean, we already talked about, before we start recording, we talked about Bertalan Meskó, who is the medical futurist, who's an MD, I think, out of Hungary. And he's just a really good, clear-eyed steward of what's coming down the pike. So if you,
we'll put a link
if you have
to
LinkedIn,
the medical futurist in the notes, for sure.
He's really good. And I think I would just go back to the recommendation around Dr. Mary Gardner's book, It's Never Long Enough. I think the more information that we have as members of this bonded pet family about quality of life and the decisions we need to make, and kind of she talks about the different budgets we have, whether it's emotional budget or financial budget. I think just being able to do the work ahead of time and having that mental, not just elasticity, but reality around what are the things that we're trying to achieve here. I think those are really. And again, that bleeds into the longevity conversation, because there's always going to be there. I think it's just a question of what do we want to do and what are we committed to doing and what are our resources allow for us to do in order to provide our pet with the highest quality of life possible, or certainly the health span versus the lifespan, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think, I think this is one of the reasons why this longevity question, when in specifically regards to pets, is such a wholesome view. I am not the tech bro who wants to live forever. I want to live a good, healthy life, and then at some point say, okay, this is as healthy as I could do, and now it's over. But many of these conversations in humans has been pushed by fear of death, fear of whatever is next. And in this case with pets, I think there is less of that, and there is more of a positivity. I want the best for this being that I get to share my life with for as long as possible, because I also recognize that quality of life is the ultimate determinant of what's going to happen. So I love both of those suggestions. They're great. We'll have links in the show notes. Thanks again. It's been great talking with you. Super appreciate the time, and look forward to the next time we get to have that conversation.
Thanks, buddy.